Sometimes the greatest wounds are the ones nobody can see. In 1878, a young woman named Eleanor arrives at a mountain cabin to marry a stranger, only to discover that her new husband won't even touch her hand. Caleb Stone is a mountain man who lives alone in the Colorado Territory. Eleanor was sent by her father to wed him as part of a debt arrangement. When she steps off the supply wagon, she finds a man who treats her like a guest instead of a wife. He sleeps on the floor while she takes his bed. He speaks only when he has to. For weeks, the tension grows between them. Eleanor begins to think he doesn't want her at all. She doesn't understand why he keeps his distance. But Caleb is hiding something that runs deeper than the mountain valleys around them. What secret makes this strong man afraid to touch his own wife? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Eleanor Whitmore first saw the Rocky Mountains, she pressed her face to the canvas window of the supply wagon and wondered if she was traveling to the edge of the world. For 3 weeks, she had bounced and rattled westward from Philadelphia, each mile taking her further from everything she had ever known. The peaks rose before her like ancient sentinels, their snow-capped summits piercing a sky so blue it seemed painted by God's own hand. "That's where you're headed." "Miss," said Jake Morrison, the weathered wagon driver who had become her unlikely companion on this journey. "Up there in them high places where the air gets thin and the silence gets thick." Eleanor adjusted her traveling dress, a practical brown wool that had already seen more adventure than her silk gowns back home ever would. Her father had chosen it for her, along with everything else in the 2 trunks that held her new life. "How much further, Mr. Morrison?" "Another day's ride up the mountain trail." Caleb Stone's place sits in a valley between 2 ridges, about as far from civilization as a man can get, and still call it home. She nodded, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. 3 weeks of travel had given her plenty of time to think about what awaited her, but thinking and knowing were different creatures entirely. Her father's debts to the bank had mounted beyond redemption, and Caleb Stone's proposal through a marriage broker had arrived like an answer to desperate prayers. A mountain man with means who needed a wife, willing to pay off Samuel Whitmore's obligations in exchange for his daughter's hand. "Tell me about him again," Eleanor asked. Though she had heard the stories multiple times during their journey, Jake spat tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. "Caleb Stone's what you might call a legend up here. Came to these mountains after the war, built himself a fine cabin, and carved out a living trapping and hunting. Man can track a deer through a snowstorm and shoot a pine cone off a branch at 100 yards. Keeps to himself mostly, comes down to town maybe twice a year for supplies. But what kind of man is he?" "Hard to say, miss. He's got a reputation for being fair in his dealings, never cheats nobody, always pays his debts. Folks respect him, though I wouldn't say they know him. He's got a way of keeping people at arm's length." Eleanor smoothed her skirts and tried to imagine sharing a home with such a man. Her education at Miss Hartwell's Academy for Young Ladies had prepared her for many things: managing a household, conversing in French, playing the piano, discussing literature, but nothing in her refined upbringing had equipped her for life with a mountain hermit. The wagon lurched over a particularly rough patch of trail, and Eleanor gripped the wooden seat to keep from tumbling. Through the gaps in the canvas, she caught glimpses of the wilderness that would be her new home. Towering pines stretched toward heaven, their branches heavy with snow, despite the late spring warmth at lower elevations. Eagle cries echoed off canyon walls, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its ancient song. "There it is," Jake announced as they crested a ridge. "Stone's Valley." Eleanor pushed aside the canvas flap and gasped. Before them spread a hidden valley, perhaps a mile wide and twice as long, cradled between steep mountain walls. A stream wound through meadows that showed the first green blush of spring grass, and stands of aspen trees caught the afternoon light like scattered coins. At the valley's heart sat a substantial log cabin, smoke rising from its stone chimney into the crystalline air. It was beautiful beyond anything she had imagined. wild and pure in a way that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. But it was also profoundly isolated, a place where a person could live an entire lifetime and never hear another human voice. As their wagon descended into the valley, Eleanor spotted movement near the cabin. A tall figure emerged from what appeared to be a barn or stable, his movements economical and purposeful. Even at a distance, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the confident way he carried himself as he watched their approach. "That's him," Jake said unnecessarily. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. In moments, she would meet the man who had agreed to marry her sight unseen. The stranger who had paid her father's debts and bought her freedom from one kind of prison, only to offer her another. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard between the cabin and the barn. Eleanor sat frozen as Jake climbed down and began speaking with the man who would be her husband. She could hear their voices but not the words, the rumble of male conversation that seemed to belong to this wild place. Then the canvas flap pulled back, and she found herself looking into the face of Caleb Stone. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35 to her 23, with dark hair that brushed his collar and eyes the color of pine forests. His face was weathered by wind and sun, but handsome in a rugged way that belonged more to frontier legends than real life. He wore a simple cotton shirt, brown wool pants, and boots that had seen hard use. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-reliance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and careful. "I'm Caleb Stone." She took the hand he offered and stepped down from the wagon, her legs shaky after the long ride. His grip was firm but brief, releasing her the moment her feet touched solid ground. "Mr. Stone," she managed, offering a small curtsy out of habit. "Thank you for everything you've done for my family." Something flickered across his expression, too quick to interpret. "Jake, help me with the ladies' trunks." As the two men unloaded her belongings, Eleanor took her first close look at what would be her new home. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the ridge, built of massive logs, chinked with clay and moss. The roof was split cedar shingles weighted down with stones, and the windows were real glass rather than the oiled paper she had expected. A wide porch stretched across the front, furnished with two chairs that suggested peaceful evenings, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Caleb paused in his lifting of her trunk. "It's remote. Nearest neighbor is 15 miles down the mountain. Sounds a full day's ride." Was he warning her or simply stating fact? Eleanor couldn't tell from his tone, which remained as carefully neutral as his expression. Jake finished securing payment for his services and climbed back onto his wagon seat. "I'll be heading back down before dark, miss. You sure you're ready for this?" Eleanor looked from the kind wagon driver to the silent man, who was now her husband in the eyes of the law, if not yet in the eyes of God or her own heart. Fear sat like a cold stone in her stomach, but beneath it she discovered something else, curiosity. This place, this man, this life, it was all so different from what she had planned that it felt like stepping into someone else's story. "I'm sure," she said. Surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, Jake nodded and flicked his reins. God bless you both," he called as the wagon rolled away, leaving Eleanor alone with her new husband in a valley that suddenly seemed very quiet and very isolated. Caleb picked up her larger trunk as if it weighed nothing and started toward the cabin. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "I'll show you where you'll be staying." Eleanor followed, noting how he had phrased it. "Not our home or where we'll be living, but where you'll be staying," as if her residence here was temporary, a brief visit rather than the beginning of a marriage. The interior of the cabin surprised her again. She had expected crude frontier accommodations, but Caleb had built his home with care and skill. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a pot of something savory simmered on an iron hook. Shelves lined one wall filled with books, more books than she would have imagined a mountain man owning. A sturdy table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by chairs he had clearly made himself. "That's the bedroom," Caleb said, nodding toward a door on the far side of the room. He set her trunk down beside it. "I'll be sleeping out here on the bench by the fire. There's a washstand and basin in there, and I've laid out some soap and towels." Eleanor stared at him. "Mr. Stone, we're married. Legally, I mean. You don't have to—" "I know what we are," he said quietly. "But legal and right aren't always the same thing. You'll have privacy and time to adjust. No pressure, no expectations." She wanted to ask what he meant, what kind of marriage this was supposed to be, but something in his expression warned her away from the subject. Instead, she nodded and said, "Thank you. That's very considerate." He moved to the fireplace and stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. "Supper's venison stew. I wasn't sure what you'd prefer, but it's what I have. It smells wonderful." Eleanor looked around the cabin again, noting the small details that revealed more about her husband than his few words had. A pair of spectacles on the mantel suggested he read by firelight in the evenings. A leather journal lay open on the table, its pages covered with sketches of animals and notes in a careful hand. Fresh wildflowers in a mason jar by the window showed an appreciation for beauty that seemed at odds with his stern demeanor. "Mr. Stone," she began, then stopped. How did one navigate a conversation with a husband who was essentially a stranger? "May I ask about your books? I noticed you have quite a collection." For the first time since her arrival, she saw something that might have been a smile touch the corners of his mouth. "Reading passes the long winter evenings. I have works of history, some poetry, a few novels. I love to read as well." "Perhaps we might—" She faltered as his expression shuttered again, the momentary warmth disappearing like sun behind a cloud. "You're welcome to borrow anything you'd like," he said formally. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to tend to the animals before dark." And with that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the beautiful, silent cabin with the smell of venison stew and the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. She sank into one of the chairs at the table and picked up his journal. Not to pry, but simply to have something to occupy her hands. The pages were filled with detailed observations of wildlife, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. The drawings were skillful, showing a keen eye for detail and a patience that suggested long hours spent in quiet observation. This was the work of a thoughtful, intelligent man, not the rough mountain hermit she had expected. So why did he treat her with such careful distance? Why had he married her at all, if he intended to keep her at arm's length? Outside, she could hear him moving about, the sound of grain being poured and animals settling for the night. The domestic normalcy of it should have been comforting, but instead it emphasized the strangeness of her situation. She was married to a man who wouldn't even share a meal with her, living in a wilderness more beautiful and isolated than anything in her experience. As the sun set behind the western peaks and darkness settled over the valley, Eleanor unpacked her few belongings and tried to make sense of her new life. Whatever Caleb Stone's reasons for maintaining such distance, she was here now, committed to this place and this marriage. She had nowhere else to go and no other options. But as she settled into the comfortable bed in his well-appointed room, listening to the sounds of him moving quietly in the main room, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would not be content to remain a stranger in her own marriage. Whatever walls Caleb had built around his heart, whatever reasons he had for keeping her at a distance, she would find a way to understand them. After all, she had nothing but time, and winter in these mountains was long and quiet. 2 weeks passed in the careful dance of polite strangers sharing a home. Eleanor established routines that brought structure to her days, preparing meals, tending the small garden behind the cabin, reading from Caleb's extensive library. He maintained his pattern of distant courtesy, speaking when necessary but never lingering for conversation, sleeping on the hard bench by the fireplace while she occupied his comfortable bed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning with the monthly supply delivery from town. The young man who brought it, Tom Bradley, was barely out of boyhood, but full of curiosity about the mysterious Mrs. Stone who had appeared in the valley. "Mail for Mrs. Stone," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "All the way from Philadelphia." Eleanor accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing her father's harsh handwriting immediately. She had been dreading this moment since her arrival, knowing that Samuel Whitmore would eventually demand proof that his arrangement had been fulfilled to his satisfaction. Caleb emerged from the barn where he had been repairing a harness, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "Tom, you'd best get those supplies unloaded before the weather turns." The young man glanced at the clear sky, but wisely chose not to argue. As he busied himself with crates and packages, Eleanor retreated to the cabin with her father's letter clutched against her chest. Inside, her hands shook as she broke the wax seal. Her father's words, written in his characteristic blunt style, hit her like physical blows. "Eleanor, it has been 3 weeks since your departure. Time enough for any proper marriage to be consummated and established. I require immediate confirmation that Mr. Stone has upheld his end of our arrangement. The bank is pressing for final resolution of my debts, and I will not tolerate any delays or complications. A marriage that exists only on paper serves no one's interests. You were sent to be a wife, not a houseguest. If Mr. Stone finds you unsuitable for his purposes, he must say so immediately so that other arrangements can be made. I expect your prompt response, confirming that all aspects of your marital duties have been properly fulfilled. Your father." Samuel Whitmore. Eleanor read the letter twice, each reading making her face burn hotter with humiliation and anger. Her father's crude implication was clear enough. He wanted assurance that the marriage had been physically consummated, that his daughter had successfully performed her part of the transaction. She crumpled the letter in her fist, then smoothed it out again. Running away from the problem would not make it disappear. Her father's debts were real, Caleb's payment was real, and their legal marriage was real. What wasn't real was any kind of actual relationship between her and the man who had saved her family from ruin. The cabin door opened and Caleb entered, his presence filling the small space in a way that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. He moved to the kitchen area and began preparing his usual simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried meat. "Bad news from home?" he asked without looking at her, his tone carefully neutral. Eleanor stood and walked to where he worked, the letter still clutched in her hand. "Mr. Stone, we need to talk." He paused in his slicing of the bread, but didn't turn around. "About what?" "About why you won't touch me." The knife clattered to the wooden counter. Caleb's shoulders tensed, and when he finally turned to face her, his expression was carefully blank. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. "We've been married for 3 weeks, and you treat me like a guest. You sleep on that uncomfortable bench, you barely speak to me, and you haven't so much as taken my hand since the day I arrived." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I told you there was no pressure, no expectations." "But there are expectations," Eleanor interrupted, holding up the letter. "My father wants proof that this marriage is real. The bank wants assurance that your payment was for a legitimate arrangement, not some elaborate fraud. What exactly is your father asking for?" Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "He wants to know if you've fulfilled your marital rights. If the marriage has been properly consummated." For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind through the pines outside. Caleb's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and something that might have been pain flickered across his features. "And what will you tell him?" he asked quietly. "I don't know." Eleanor set the letter on the table between them. "I don't understand what kind of marriage this is supposed to be. You paid my father's debts, you brought me here as your wife, but you won't even share a meal with me, let alone a bed. If you find me unsuitable, if you regret the arrangement, please just say so. I can find some other solution. You're not unsuitable." The words came out sharper than he seemed to intend. "That's not the problem. Then what is the problem?" Eleanor moved closer, noting how he stepped back to maintain the distance between them. "Are you afraid of me? Do I remind you of someone you'd rather forget? Are you still grieving another woman?" Each question hit its mark. She could see it in the way his expression shifted, the way his hands clenched at his sides. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled, revealing nothing. My reasons are my own. I thought I was being considerate, giving you time to adjust to this place, to me. If you need me to write a letter to your father confirming the marriage is legitimate, I'll do that. That's not enough. Eleanor surprised herself with her vehemence. I didn't come here to live as a stranger in someone else's house. I came here to be a wife, to build a life with the man I married. If you can't give me that, if you won't even try, then we're both living a lie. Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. Some things once broken can't be fixed. What things? What's broken? But he was already moving toward the door, his retreat as deliberate as everything else about him. I'll write to your father. Tell him the marriage is real and binding, and his debts are settled. That should satisfy the bank. Caleb, wait. The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving Eleanor alone with her father's demanding letter and a dozen new questions about the man she had married. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the barn, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. For the first time since her arrival, she had seen cracks in his carefully maintained composure. The pain that had flickered across his face when she mentioned another woman. The way he had stepped back when she moved closer. The stark admission that something in him was broken beyond repair. These were the first real clues to understanding Caleb Stone. Eleanor sank into a chair and stared at her father's letter. She could write back and lie, tell him the marriage was everything he expected it to be. She could accept Caleb's offer to write his own confirmation and hope that would satisfy the bank. She could continue living this strange half-life, sharing a home with a husband who treated her like a polite stranger, or she could fight for something more. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the comfortable room that felt more like a sanctuary than a home. Caleb had built this place with his own hands, filled it with books and small touches of beauty, created a refuge from whatever demons pursued him. But it was also a prison, keeping him isolated from human connection and her trapped in a marriage that existed only on paper. Eleanor rose and moved to the kitchen, beginning preparations for the evening meal. When Caleb returned from whatever refuge he had sought in the barn, she would be here. She would continue to be here day after day, until either he found the courage to let her into his carefully guarded world, or she found the strength to break down the walls herself. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the western peaks, promising one of the sudden mountain tempests that Jake Morrison had warned her about. Eleanor watched the sky darken and felt a strange sense of anticipation. Perhaps it was time for storms, in the weather and in the careful silence that had settled over their unreal marriage. She picked up her father's letter one more time, then carried it to the fireplace and fed it to the flames. Whatever Samuel Whitmore expected of her, whatever the bank required for their records, the real business of her marriage would be settled between her and Caleb. In their own time and their own way, the paper curled and blackened, carrying her father's crude demands up the chimney in smoke. Eleanor watched it burn and felt something shift inside her chest, a hardening of resolve that surprised her with its strength. She had come to these mountains as payment for her father's debts, a transaction disguised as a marriage. But she was still here by choice, and that choice gave her power she was only beginning to understand. Caleb Stone might be determined to keep her at arm's length, but Eleanor Whitmore had not traveled across a continent to live as a stranger in her own home. Whatever had broken him, whatever pain he carried, she would find a way to reach him. The alternative, a lifetime of polite distance and careful loneliness, was simply unacceptable. Outside, the first rumble of thunder echoed off the mountain walls, and Eleanor smiled grimly as she began setting the table for two. Let the storms come. She was ready for them. The storm Eleanor had sensed building broke that very evening, arriving with the sudden violence that characterized mountain weather. She was setting plates on the table when the first crack of lightning split the sky. followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Caleb entered just as the rain began, water dripping from his hat and coat. He hung both on pegs by the door and moved to warm his hands by the fire, pointedly not looking at the table set for two. Quite a storm, Eleanor observed, ladling stew into bowls, as if their earlier confrontation had never happened. "Spring storms can be fierce up here," he replied carefully. "The cabin's solid, though, built to weather anything these mountains can throw at it." Eleanor set one bowl at his usual place and the other at the chair across from it. "I hope you're hungry." "I made enough for both of us." For a moment she thought he might refuse, might take his bowl and retreat to some other part of the cabin, as he had done for the past 2 weeks. But something in the weather, or perhaps in her determined normalcy, seemed to wear down his resistance. He approached the table slowly and took his seat. They ate in silence at first, the storm providing a natural soundtrack of wind and rain. Eleanor found herself studying her husband when she thought he wasn't looking, noting details she had missed in their brief, formal interactions. His hands, large and capable, showed the calluses of hard work, but also an unexpected gentleness in how he handled his spoon and cup. A thin scar traced along his left temple, barely visible beneath his dark hair. When he thought she wasn't watching, his expression held a sadness that seemed to run deeper than simple solitude. "This is very good," he said finally. The first voluntary comment he had made about her cooking. "Thank you. My mother taught me before she died. She always said that a woman who couldn't feed her family properly had forgotten her most basic duty." Something in her tone made him look up. "How old were you when you lost her?" 15. Consumption took her over the course of a long winter. "After that, it was just my father and me until—" She gestured around the cabin. "Until this arrangement," Caleb nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. Losing a parent is hard at any age, but 15, that's still a child. Were you close to your parents?" The shuttered look began to return to his face, but another crash of thunder seemed to startle him out of his usual retreat. "My father died when I was 12. Farming accident. My mother struggled for a few years, then remarried. My stepfather didn't much care for having another man's son around, so I left when I was 16. Where did you go?" "Worked various jobs, learned different trades. When the war came, I enlisted." His voice became even more careful. "Served with the 5th Ohio Infantry." Eleanor had heard enough war stories to recognize the weight those simple words carried. The 5th Ohio had seen some of the bloodiest fighting of the conflict. Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. Men who had served in such units carried scars that went far deeper than flesh. "You must have been very young when you enlisted." 18. Old enough to hold a rifle, they said. Caleb pushed stew around his bowl, lost in memories she couldn't see. Seemed like a grand adventure at the time. See the country, serve the cause, come home a hero. And did you? "Come home a hero, I mean?" The question hung between them as another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin windows. When Caleb finally answered, his voice was barely audible above the storm. "I came home." That was more than many could say. Eleanor sensed they were approaching dangerous ground. The edges of whatever pain kept him so carefully isolated. But before she could frame another question, a new sound cut through the storm, the sharp crack of breaking wood, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire cabin. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his transformation from quiet dinner companion to alert warrior so swift it took Eleanor's breath away. "Stay here," he commanded, grabbing a rifle from hooks above the fireplace. What was that? Tree fell, most likely. Could have damaged the barn or the lean-to where I keep the winter feed. He was already moving toward the door, checking the rifle's load with practiced efficiency. "Sometimes the wind gets strong enough to bring down even the big ones." Eleanor watched him prepare to venture into the storm and felt her heart catch. "You can't go out in this weather. It's too dangerous. The animals need shelter, and if that tree damaged the barn, they could be hurt or trapped." He pulled on his coat and hat, then paused at the door. "Keep the fire going and the rifle loaded. I'll be back soon." "Caleb, wait." But he was already gone, swallowed by the darkness and driving rain. Eleanor moved to the window and peered out, but could see nothing beyond the reflection of lamplight on glass. The storm seemed to have intensified since his departure. The wind howling through the valley with a voice that sounded almost human. She paced the cabin, checking the fire, straightening things that didn't need straightening, trying not to imagine all the ways a man could be injured or killed in a mountain storm. When she could stand the waiting no longer, she lit a lantern and positioned it in the window, hoping its light might help guide him home. An hour passed before she heard his voice calling from outside. Eleanor rushed to open the door, letting in a gust of wind and rain, along with her thoroughly soaked husband. "Thank God," she breathed, helping him out of his dripping coat. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." But she could see he was shivering, his lips tinged blue with cold. Big Pine came down across the back corner of the barn, took out about 10 feet of roof, but the animals are safe. I managed to get them moved to the undamaged section. Eleanor was already moving toward the fire, stirring up the coals and adding fresh wood. "You need to get warm, and out of those wet clothes. I'll be fine once I—" "Sit down." Her tone brooked no argument, and perhaps he was too cold and tired to resist. He sank into the chair closest to the fire, while Eleanor disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a thick blanket and dry clothes. "Change into these," she said, handing him the garments. "I'll turn around." For a moment she thought he might argue, maintain some vestige of the formal distance that had characterized their relationship. But practicality won out. She heard the rustle of wet fabric being removed and replaced. The quiet sounds of a man too cold to worry about modesty. "You can turn around," he said finally. Eleanor turned to find him wrapped in the blanket, his wet hair combed back from his face, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. She poured coffee from the pot that had been keeping warm by the fire and pressed the hot cup into his hands. "Drink this. It'll help warm you from the inside." He accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted it to his lips. "You don't need to fuss over me. I've weathered worse storms than this." "I'm sure you have." Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, noting how the firelight played across his features, softening the hard lines of his face. "But that doesn't mean you have to weather this one alone." Something in her tone made him look up, and for a moment their eyes met across the small space. In that brief connection, Eleanor saw past his carefully maintained barriers to the man beneath, weary, guarded, but not unkind, not unfeeling. "The animals," she said softly. "You risked your life for them. They depend on me. I don't take that responsibility lightly. Is that what I am to you? Another responsibility?" The question was out before she could stop it, hanging in the warm air between them like a challenge. Caleb's grip tightened on his coffee cup, and she saw the familiar walls beginning to rise again. "Eleanor, it's all right," she said quickly. "You don't have to answer that. But I want you to know something. Whatever brought you to these mountains, whatever you're running from or trying to forget, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. You don't know what you're saying, don't I?" Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but determined. "I see how carefully you live, how you've built this beautiful place and filled it with books and small comforts, but you won't let yourself truly enjoy any of it. I see how you care for the animals, how you built this cabin to last for generations, but you live like you're just passing through. And I see how you look at me sometimes when you think I'm not watching, like you want something you're afraid to reach for." Caleb was very still, his coffee forgotten in his hands. "Some things are better left alone, and some things are worth fighting for." Eleanor rose and moved to the window where the storm still raged, though with less violence than before. "My father sent me here as payment for his debts, but I'm choosing to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to understand the man who would pay a stranger's debts to marry a woman he'd never met. There's kindness in that, Caleb, even if you don't want to admit it." When she turned back, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The storm was moving on, the thunder growing more distant, but the intimacy of the evening seemed to linger in the warm cabin. "You should get some rest," he said finally. Tomorrow I'll need to start repairs on the barn, and there's a lot of work ahead. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the gentle dismissal for what it was. But as she moved toward the bedroom, she paused beside his chair and did something that surprised them both. She rested her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for going out in the storm, for protecting the animals, for all of it." She felt the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself perfectly still beneath her touch. But he didn't pull away, and when she lifted her hand, she thought she heard the softest exhale, as if he had been holding his breath. "Good night, Caleb. Good night." Eleanor, as she prepared for bed in the privacy of the bedroom, Eleanor reflected on the evening's small victories. For the first time since her arrival, they had shared a meal and a genuine conversation. She had seen past his careful reserve to the man beneath, and perhaps more importantly, she had seen him struggle with his own barriers. The way he had spoken about the war, the pain that shadowed his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he held himself apart from human connection. These were all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. Outside, the storm was finally moving on, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent of rain-washed air and the promise of clear skies tomorrow. Eleanor fell asleep to the sound of settling timbers and the whisper of wind through the pines, with the memory of Caleb's shoulder beneath her hand and the knowledge that she had taken her first real step into her husband's closely guarded world. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the air washed clean and sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Eleanor woke to the sound of sawing and hammering, evidence that Caleb had already begun repairs on the damaged barn. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find him stripped to his shirt sleeves, working to clear away the massive pine that had fallen in the night. "Good morning," she called, carrying a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits she had prepared while he worked. Caleb paused in his sawing and straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Morning. You didn't need to bring me breakfast. I thought you might be hungry." Eleanor set the plate on a nearby stump and handed him the coffee. "How bad is the damage?" "Could have been worse. The tree took out about 12 feet of roof and damaged some of the support beams, but the foundation is solid. I'll have it repaired within a week or two." Eleanor studied the fallen giant, its massive trunk easily 3 feet in diameter. "It must be 100 years old. Closer to 200, I'd guess. These old pines have weathered storms for generations before one finally brought them down." Caleb accepted the coffee gratefully, and Eleanor noticed he didn't immediately retreat to maintain their usual distance. "What can I do to help?" He shook his head. "This is heavy work, dangerous work. I can manage it myself. I'm stronger than I look," Eleanor protested. "And I learn quickly. I'm sure you do, but Caleb..." She used his name deliberately, noting how he stiffened slightly when she did. "I know you're used to doing everything yourself, but we're married now. Your problems are my problems. Your work is my work. Let me help." For a moment she thought he would refuse again, fall back on his practiced self-reliance. But something in her tone, or perhaps the simple logic of her argument, seemed to reach him. "All right," he said finally, "but you do exactly what I say when I say it." "No arguments?" "Agreed." The next few hours proved to be a revelation for both of them. Eleanor quickly discovered that her husband was a patient and thorough teacher, explaining each task before they attempted it, and watching carefully to ensure she understood the safety considerations. She learned to handle the two-man crosscut saw, to notch logs for proper joining, to read the grain of wood to predict how it would split. More importantly, she learned to work alongside Caleb without the careful formality that had defined their previous interactions. As the morning progressed, she saw glimpses of the man beneath his reserved exterior, the dry sense of humor that emerged when she made a particularly clumsy mistake, the quiet satisfaction he took in good craftsmanship, the unconscious way he moved to steady her when she struggled with a heavy beam. "You're getting the hang of it," he said, as she successfully split a shingle with clean, even strokes of the froe and mallet. "I had a good teacher." Eleanor wiped sweat from her face, leaving a streak of sawdust across her cheek. though I suspect I'm slowing you down considerably. Some things are worth taking time to do right." Their eyes met across the work area, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the warmth she saw in his expression. For just a moment, his guard was completely down, and she glimpsed the man he might be if he weren't carrying whatever burden kept him so isolated. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Both of them turned to see a rider approaching from the mouth of the valley, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a casual visit. Caleb's transformation was immediate and startling. His relaxed posture became alert, his expression turning hard and watchful. Eleanor noticed that his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against a nearby tree. "Friend of yours?" she asked quietly. "Hard to say. We don't get many unexpected visitors up here." The rider proved to be a middle-aged man Eleanor didn't recognize, wearing a deputy's badge and the grim expression of someone bearing bad news. He reined in his lathered horse and tipped his hat politely. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone. Name's Deputy Marshal Peters from Silverton. I'm afraid I have some troubling news." Caleb moved almost imperceptibly, positioning himself between Eleanor and the lawman. "What kind of news?" "Bandits hit the Henderson place yesterday evening, just after the storm passed. Family's all right, but they made off with most of the livestock and whatever cash they had stored up for winter supplies." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The Henderson place was the nearest homestead to theirs, 15 miles down the mountain, but still their closest neighbors. "How many men?" Caleb's voice was calm, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Near as we can tell, 5 or 6 riders. They knew what they were looking for and where to find it, which suggests they'd been watching the place for a while." Peters shifted in his saddle, his eyes moving constantly as he scanned the valley around them. "Sheriff sent me to warn the isolated homesteads. These aren't desperate men making random strikes. They're organized, and they're working their way through the territory systematically." "Any description of the men?" "Mixed group, from what Henderson could tell. A couple of Mexicans, at least one colored man, and what looked like white deserters from one army or another. Leader seemed to be a tall fellow with a red beard, missing his left eye." Eleanor saw Caleb's expression change at that description, a flicker of recognition followed by something that might have been fear. The transformation was so subtle that the deputy missed it entirely. But Eleanor had been watching her husband closely enough to catch the brief crack in his composure. "I appreciate the warning," Caleb said carefully. "We'll keep our eyes open. That's all any of us can do for now. Sheriff's putting together a posse, but tracking men through these mountains is slow work, especially after yesterday's storm." Peters gathered his reins. "You folks might want to consider coming into town until this is resolved. I know you're isolated up here, and if these bandits are working their way through the territory, we'll be fine," Caleb interrupted. "This place is defensible, and I know these mountains better than any group of drifters." The deputy looked doubtful, but nodded. "Your choice, Mr. Stone. Just remember, there's no shame in being cautious. These men have already shown they're willing to use violence." After Peters had ridden away, Eleanor and Caleb stood in silence, watching until the deputy disappeared around a bend in the trail. The peaceful morning had taken on a different quality. The isolation that had seemed romantic and adventurous, now feeling vulnerable and exposed. "Caleb," Eleanor said carefully, "you recognized that description, didn't you? The red-bearded man with one eye?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with old anger. "His name is Marcus Briggs. He was a sergeant in the Confederate cavalry, though by the end of the war, he was more bandit than soldier. I had dealings with him during the fighting." "What kind of dealings?" Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "My unit was assigned to track down Confederate raiders who were terrorizing Union supply lines and civilian settlements. Briggs and his men had burned out 3 homesteads and killed a family trying to protect their livestock. We caught up with them in a box canyon near Chattanooga. What happened? We fought. Most of his men were killed, but Briggs escaped. Not before I put a rifle ball through his left eye and left him for dead." Caleb's hand moved unconsciously to the rifle again. Apparently, I should have made sure of the job. Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. You think he's here because of you. I think Marcus Briggs is the kind of man who holds grudges. If he's learned that the soldier who cost him his eye and most of his men is living up here with a new wife. He didn't finish the sentence. But Eleanor could fill in the implications herself. Then we should go to town, like the deputy suggested. No. Caleb's response was immediate and firm. Running would only delay the inevitable. Besides, Briggs knows these mountains too, and a man running scared makes mistakes. Here I have advantages, defensible ground, knowledge of the terrain, and all the supplies I need for a siege. Eleanor stared at him, seeing her husband in a new light. The careful, reserved man she had been trying to understand was also a veteran of some of the war's bloodiest campaigns. A soldier who had tracked Confederate raiders through hostile territory and survived firefights that had killed most of his enemies. What do you need me to do? The question seemed to surprise him. Eleanor, you don't understand. If Briggs is coming here for revenge, if he knows I have a wife, then we face it together. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. You said this place was defensible. Teach me what I need to know to help defend it. Caleb studied her face, looking for signs of fear or doubt. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from protective to practical. All right. First, we finish securing the barn. If we're going to be under siege, we'll need all the livestock protected. Then I'll show you the positions I've prepared around the cabin and teach you to handle the weapons properly. Positions you've prepared? Eleanor looked around the valley with new eyes, suddenly noticing details she had missed before, the way certain trees had been cut to provide clear fields of fire, the careful placement of wood piles and stone walls that could serve as cover. I didn't survive 4 years of war by being unprepared, Caleb said simply. A man makes enemies in wartime, and some of those enemies have long memories. As they returned to work on the barn repairs, Eleanor found herself studying her husband with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The quiet mountain man who preferred books to company was also a soldier who had planned his home's defenses with military precision. The gentle teacher who had patiently shown her how to split shingles was also a veteran who had tracked and fought Confederate raiders. But most unsettling of all was the realization that their strange, careful marriage might be about to face its first real test. If Marcus Briggs was indeed coming for revenge, he would find not just Caleb Stone, but Caleb Stone's wife. And despite all the walls her husband had built around his heart, Eleanor was beginning to understand that protecting her might be the one thing that could bring them crashing down. As she worked beside him, learning the skills that might keep them both alive, Eleanor kept her delicate china teacup carefully wrapped in her trunk. It seemed like a relic from another life now, a reminder of the refined woman she had been before she chose to fight for a marriage with a man who might have to kill to keep her safe. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing intimacy. Caleb threw himself into fortifying their valley with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had learned that survival depended on attention to detail. Eleanor found herself drawn into his plans, not as a protected observer, but as a full partner in their defense. The cabin sits in the best possible position, Caleb explained as they walked the perimeter of their property. Mountains on 3 sides. The valley mouth narrow enough that riders can only approach 2 or 3 abreast. The stream provides fresh water even if we're pinned down for weeks. Eleanor studied the landscape with new eyes, seeing how the natural features could be turned into defensive advantages. What about those rocks above the valley entrance? Could someone position themselves there to shoot down at us? Good eye. Caleb's approval warmed her more than she expected. I've got that covered. He led her to a cluster of boulders that seemed naturally placed, but which, she now realized, had been carefully positioned to provide cover and clear sightlines to the high ground. A man with a rifle here can control the entire approach, and that man would be you. If it comes to that. He showed her how to load and aim the spare rifle he had cleaned and prepared for her use. "But I'd rather have you positioned here, where you can cover the cabin and the barn. If things go badly, this position gives you multiple escape routes into the high country." Eleanor hefted the rifle, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to transform in her hands from tool to weapon. "You're teaching me to fight, but you're also planning for me to run." "I'm planning for every possibility." Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact, but she caught the underlying tension. "If Briggs comes here with 5 or 6 men, our best chance is to make the cost of taking this place higher than he's willing to pay. But if that fails, I understand." Eleanor sighted down the rifle barrel, aiming at a distant pine. "But you should know that I won't abandon you. Whatever happens, we face it together." Something flickered across Caleb's expression. Surprise, gratitude, perhaps even fear. "Eleanor, you don't know what you're saying. War isn't like the stories in books. It's ugly and brutal, and good people die for no better reason than being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Is that what happened to her? The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it, born from intuition and the pain she glimpsed in his eyes whenever he spoke of loss. Caleb went very still, his hands freezing on the rifle he had been adjusting. "Who?" "The woman you loved before, the one who died while you were fighting." For a moment Eleanor thought he might retreat behind his usual walls of silence. But something in the afternoon light, or perhaps in the knowledge that they might both be dead within days, seemed to loosen his tongue. "Her name was Sarah." His voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Sarah Mitchell. We were engaged before I left for the war. Planned to marry when I came home." Eleanor waited, sensing that this confidence was as fragile as spun glass, easily shattered by the wrong word or gesture. "She lived on a farm, about 20 miles from my family's place. Wrote me letters every week for the first 2 years of the war, telling me about the seasons changing, the crops, her plans for our wedding." Caleb's hands moved restlessly on his rifle. "Then the letters stopped coming. What happened?" "Confederate raiders. A group much like Briggs and his men, living off the land and terrorizing anyone they thought might be supporting the Union cause. They hit the Mitchell farm in the spring of '63, looking for food and horses. Sarah's father tried to protect his livestock, and they shot him down in his own yard." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with dread. Already guessing the rest of the story, Sarah ran to help him, and one of the raiders, a boy really, probably no older than 16, panicked and shot her too. By the time neighbors found them, both were dead. The raiders had taken everything of value and burned the house to the ground. "Oh, Caleb." Eleanor reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it gripped the rifle. "I'm so sorry. I didn't learn about it until 3 months later, when the army finally managed to get mail through to our unit. By then, she'd been buried in the churchyard for months. I never even got to say goodbye." His voice carried a weight of old grief that made Eleanor's heart ache. "I spent the rest of the war hunting raiders like the ones who killed her. Told myself I was protecting other families from the same fate. But really, I was just trying to kill enough of them to make the pain stop." Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself rigid against the memories. "Is that why you came to these mountains? To escape the memories? To escape the guilt?" The admission seemed to cost him. "I should have been there to protect her. Should have found a way to get home. Should have convinced her family to move somewhere safer. Instead, I was hundreds of miles away, fighting a war that didn't save the one person who mattered most to me. You couldn't have known. I could have chosen differently." Caleb's voice was harsh with self-recrimination. "I chose duty over love, chose to serve my country rather than protect my woman. And she died because of that choice." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her hands framing his face and forcing him to meet her eyes. "You chose to serve something larger than yourself, to fight for a cause you believed in. That's not selfishness, Caleb, that's honor. Sarah would have understood that. You don't know what she would have understood. You'd never met her." "No, but I know you." Eleanor's voice was firm, cutting through his protests. "I've lived in your house, eaten food you prepared, slept safely under your protection. I've seen how you care for the animals. how you've built this place to last for generations, how you went out in a dangerous storm to make sure nothing was hurt. A man who would do those things is not a man who would abandon the woman he loved out of selfishness." Caleb stared at her, and Eleanor saw the war playing out in his expression, the desire to believe her words, battling against years of self-blame and isolation. "She died alone," he said finally. "While I was playing soldier hundreds of miles away, she died alone and afraid in her father's arms. But she lived knowing you loved her. She wrote you letters for 2 years, Caleb. That means she believed in your love, believed you would come home to her. Even at the end, she knew she was cherished by a good man who would have moved heaven and earth to protect her if he could." Eleanor watched her words sink in, saw some of the rigid tension leave his shoulders. Without thinking, she stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "And now," she said softly, "I'm here. Not because I have to be, not because of my father's debts or any legal arrangement, but because I choose to be. Because I've seen the man you are beneath all that guilt and isolation, and I want to know him better." "Eleanor," his voice was rough, uncertain. "You're afraid that caring for me will put me in danger, that loving me will somehow betray Sarah's memory. But she's gone, Caleb, and you're still here. Still alive, still capable of love and happiness and all the things that make life worth living." She was close enough now to see the pulse beating at the base of his throat, close enough to feel the slight tremor in his hands where they still held the rifle. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, turning the air golden and warm, and for a moment, the threat of approaching bandits seemed very far away. "I'm not asking you to forget her," Eleanor whispered. "I'm asking you to remember that you deserve to be happy, that we both deserve a chance at something real." For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. She saw the want flicker in his eyes, saw his gaze drop to her lips. But then something shifted, some internal wall slamming back into place, and he stepped away from her with careful deliberation. "We should get back to the cabin," he said, his voice once again controlled and distant. "There's still work to do before dark." Eleanor felt the familiar sting of his retreat, but this time it was tempered by understanding. She had seen past his defenses to the wounded heart beneath, had glimpsed the guilt and grief that kept him isolated from human connection. More importantly, she had seen that he was capable of love, had loved Sarah Mitchell with a devotion that had survived death and years of separation. If he could love like that once, he could love like that again. She just had to find the patience and courage to wait for his heart to heal enough to risk caring for someone new. As they walked back toward the cabin, Eleanor noticed something she had missed before, a cluster of wildflowers growing near the stream, their delicate purple blooms bright against the green grass. On impulse, she stopped and picked one, pressing it between the pages of the small Bible she carried in her apron pocket. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, pausing to wait for her. "Preserving something beautiful," Eleanor replied, catching up to him. "My mother taught me that pressing flowers was a way of holding on to moments that might otherwise be forgotten." She didn't tell him that this particular flower would always remind her of the afternoon he had trusted her, enough to share his deepest pain. The moment when she had first truly understood the man she had married. Some things were too precious for words, too fragile to examine too closely, but as they approached the cabin together, Eleanor touched the Bible in her pocket and smiled. However their current troubles resolved, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would always have this moment when Caleb Stone had let her see his heart. And pressed between the pages of Scripture, a simple wildflower would serve as proof that even in the shadow of approaching danger, beauty and hope could still take root and flourish. That evening, as they shared another meal by the firelight, Eleanor noticed that Caleb seemed more present than he had since her arrival. The revelation about Sarah had cost him, but it had also lifted some invisible burden from his shoulders. He asked about her life in Philadelphia, listened to her stories about Miss Hartwell's academy and the social obligations that had filled her days before her father's debts changed. Everything. It sounds like a different world, he said when she described the elaborate dinner parties and afternoon teas that had once structured her social calendar. It was a different world. Sometimes I wonder if that woman even existed, or if she was just playing a role I thought was expected of me. Eleanor set down her cup and studied her hands, noting the calluses that had formed from their work together. I've learned more about myself in these past weeks than I did in 23 years of being the perfect lady. And what have you learned? Eleanor considered the question, surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice. That I'm stronger than I thought. That I actually enjoy physical work, the satisfaction of building something or fixing something with my own hands. That I don't need constant company or entertainment to be happy. She paused, then added more softly, and that I'm capable of loving someone I barely know. If that someone is worth loving. Caleb's hand stilled on his coffee cup. Eleanor, you don't have to say anything, she said quickly. I'm not asking for declarations or promises. I just want you to know that whatever happens with these bandits, whatever danger we're facing, I'm here by choice. Not because of legal obligations or family arrangements, but because I want to be. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them and the night sounds of the mountain providing a peaceful backdrop. Eleanor found herself memorizing the scene, the way the firelight played across Caleb's features, the quiet intimacy of sharing a simple meal, the sense of partnership that had grown between them despite his emotional barriers. It was Caleb who finally broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. There's something I need to show you. He rose and moved to a wooden chest near the window, extracting a small, worn object that he carried back to the firelight. As he placed it on the table between them, Eleanor saw that it was a pocket watch, its silver case tarnished and dented, its crystal face cracked in a spiderweb pattern. This was my father's, Caleb said quietly. He gave it to me the day I left for the war. Said it would help me remember that time passes and wounds heal, that nothing lasts forever, not pain, not separation, not even war. Eleanor picked up the watch carefully, noting that its hands were frozen at 11 minutes past 3. What happened to it? Confederate artillery at Gettysburg. I was carrying it in my breast pocket when a shell exploded nearby. The shrapnel should have killed me, but the watch took most of the impact. He touched the largest crack in the crystal. Been meaning to have it repaired for 15 years, but somehow I never get around to it. Eleanor understood immediately. The broken watch was like everything else in Caleb's carefully controlled life, frozen at the moment of trauma, preserved in its damaged state rather than risked in the uncertain process of healing. Why are you showing me this? Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because looking at you these past few days, watching you work beside me and refuse to run when danger threatens, it makes me remember what it felt like to want something more than just survival. And that terrifies me more than any group of bandits ever could. Eleanor set the watch down gently, her heart racing at the admission. Why does it terrify you? Because wanting something means you can lose it. And I'm not sure I could survive losing someone again. His eyes met hers across the table, and she saw all the longing and fear he had been trying so hard to hide. I've built a good life here, a safe life. I have everything I need, and I don't depend on anyone else for my happiness. It's not much, but it's enough, is it? Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but challenging. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've built a very beautiful prison. You have books, but no one to discuss them with. You have this gorgeous valley, but no one to share its beauty. You have skills and knowledge and so much to offer, but you keep it all locked away, where it can't be touched or threatened or lost. Caleb's jaw tightened. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with protecting yourself from more pain? Nothing, Eleanor said softly. If you're content to live half a life, if you're willing to let fear make all your choices for you, if you can honestly say that existing is enough, and you don't want anything more. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, noting how he didn't pull away this time. But I don't think you are content. Caleb, I think you're just tired of hurting, tired of hoping for things that might be taken away. And I understand that, I truly do. But Sarah is gone, and you're still here. You still have a heart capable of love, hands capable of building, a future that could be filled with something more than just memories of what you've lost. You make it sound simple. It's not simple at all. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the only way to really live instead of just surviving. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky above their valley. My mother used to say that the heart is like a garden. You can let it go wild and overgrown, choked with weeds of old pain and regret. Or you can tend it carefully, clearing away what no longer serves you and planting new seeds that might grow into something beautiful. She turned back to face him, her voice steady with conviction. I want to help you tend your garden, Caleb. Not because I think I can fix you or change you, but because I've seen glimpses of the man you could be if you weren't so afraid of being hurt again. And that man, the one who risks his life for animals, who builds beautiful things to last for generations, who carries his father's broken watch because he's not ready to let go of the past, that man is worth fighting for. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the battle raging in his expression. The desire for connection warring with the fear of loss, hope struggling against the weight of old grief. What if I can't? He asked finally. What if I'm too damaged, too set in my ways? What if I disappoint you? Then we'll figure it out together, Eleanor said simply. I'm not asking for perfection, Caleb. I'm asking for honesty, for effort, for the chance to build something real between us. Even if it's difficult, even if it's messy, even if we both make mistakes along the way. She moved back to the table and picked up the broken watch again, turning it over in her hands. This watch stopped working the day you almost died. But it's not broken beyond repair. It just needs someone willing to take the time and care to fix it properly. Looking up at him, she added softly, the same might be true for your heart. Caleb reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the watch from her hands. For a moment, their fingers intertwined around the small, damaged timepiece, and Eleanor felt a current of understanding pass between them. I want to try, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know if I can be the husband you deserve, but I want to try. You've been braver than I have from the moment you stepped off that wagon. And maybe it's time I found some of that courage myself. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and hope, and something that might have been the beginning of real love. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, she said gently. We just have to be willing to begin. As if to seal the promise they had made to each other, Caleb lifted their joined hands and brushed his lips across her knuckles in the gentlest of kisses. It was barely a touch over almost before it began, but it carried more weight than any passionate embrace could have. Tomorrow, he said quietly, after we deal with whatever Briggs and his men bring to our valley, I'll take this watch to town and have it repaired properly. It's time to let it keep time again. Eleanor smiled, understanding the symbolism in his words. The broken watch represented 15 years of frozen grief, of a heart that had stopped believing in the possibility of healing. If Caleb was ready to have it repaired, he was ready to believe that time could move forward again, that life could be more than just an endless preservation of old wounds. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the high country, its voice echoing off the canyon walls in a song both mournful and wild. But inside the cabin, Eleanor felt only warmth and the first tentative stirrings of hope. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, not as strangers bound by legal obligation, but as two people who had chosen to risk their hearts on the possibility of love. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of Caleb moving quietly around the cabin, checking weapons and securing last-minute preparations. The intimacy of the previous evening felt both precious and fragile in the grey pre-dawn light, like something that might shatter if examined too closely. Coffee's ready, he said softly when he noticed she was awake. And I've laid out some jerky and hardtack. We should eat well this morning in case we're too busy staying alive to worry about proper meals later. Eleanor finished, accepting the cup he offered. How long do you think we have?
Hard to say.
If Briggs is working his way through the territory systematically, he might not reach us for days. But if he knows I'm here specifically—" Caleb's words were cut off by the distant sound of a single gunshot echoing across the valley from the direction of the trail. Both of them froze, listening intently for follow-up shots that never came. "Signal shot," Caleb said grimly. "Someone announcing their presence, probably hoping to draw us out or at least get our attention." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with fear, but her voice remained steady. "What do? We wait. Let them make the first move and show us what we're dealing with." Caleb moved to the window and peered out through the gap in the curtains. "But first, there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you yesterday." The serious tone in his voice made Eleanor look up sharply. "What is it?" Caleb moved away from the window and went to the wooden chest where he had retrieved his father's watch the night before. This time, he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, handling it with the careful reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "I told you I hunted Confederate raiders during the war," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "What I didn't tell you was how good I got at it, or what that cost me." Eleanor recognized Sarah's letters immediately, the carefully scripted handwriting, the feminine touch of the ribbon, the way Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he held them. But there was something else in the bundle, something that made her breath catch. A medal. Congressional Medal of Honor. Its bronze surface tarnished, but still bearing the clear inscription, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty." "Caleb," she whispered, "you never said, 'because it doesn't matter.' Because the things I did to earn this—" He gestured at the medal as if it were something distasteful. "They weren't acts of heroism. They were acts of vengeance, dressed up in military language to make them palatable." Another gunshot echoed across the valley, closer this time, followed by the sound of voices carried on the morning air. Eleanor could make out individual words. Crude laughter, someone shouting orders, the general commotion of men who weren't particularly concerned about stealth. "Tell me," Eleanor said urgently, sensing that whatever Caleb was about to reveal would be crucial to understanding not just his past, but their current danger. "After Sarah died, I volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every scouting mission behind enemy lines. I became obsessed with tracking down raiders like the ones who had killed her. My commanding officers thought I was just an exceptionally dedicated soldier. But the truth was simpler. I wanted to kill as many of them as possible." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting someone else's story. "I got very good at it. I could track a man through country that would lose an Indian scout. I could move through enemy territory like a ghost, strike without warning, and disappear before anyone knew I'd been there. The men in my unit called me Phantom, and enemy forces learned to fear the name." Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. The quiet, reserved man she had married was also the legendary soldier whose reputation had apparently survived the war. "The medal came after Chattanooga, when I tracked Briggs and his raiders to their hideout and eliminated most of them single-handedly. Official report said I rescued civilian hostages and disrupted enemy supply lines. What it didn't say was that I could have taken most of those men alive, could have ended the fight without so much bloodshed. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Caleb met her eyes, and Eleanor saw the weight of old guilt and self-loathing there. "I wanted them dead, every single one of them, because in my mind they were all responsible for Sarah's death, all deserving of the same fate that had befallen her." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer now, multiple riders moving with the casual confidence of men who weren't expecting serious resistance. Eleanor forced herself to focus on Caleb's story, sensing that understanding his past might be the key to surviving their present crisis. "What happened when you found Briggs?" "I put a rifle ball through his left eye, like I told you." "But there was more to it than that." Caleb's hands tightened on Sarah's letters. "Before I shot him, I told him exactly who I was and why I was there. I wanted him to know that Sarah Mitchell's death had consequences. that someone had come specifically to make him pay for what he'd done to innocent people. Eleanor felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. And you think he remembers that conversation? I know he remembers, because I made sure he would. I wanted him to carry the knowledge that his actions had earned him a very personal enemy, someone who would never stop hunting him. Caleb's voice carried a bitter edge. I was young and angry and full of righteous fury. I thought I was serving justice, and now he's here for revenge. Now he's here to finish what started in that canyon 15 years ago. But this time, he knows I have something to lose. Caleb looked toward the window, where the sounds of approaching riders were growing louder. He knows about you. Eleanor felt the full weight of their situation settling over her like a cold blanket. This wasn't a random bandit attack or a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a personal vendetta, a war that had been fought to a bloody stalemate years ago and was now resuming with her caught in the middle. How could he know about me? News travels even in these mountains. Word of our marriage would have reached the settlements eventually, and from there, Caleb shrugged grimly. Briggs has always been careful about gathering intelligence before he strikes. If he's planning to take me down, he'd want to know everything about my current situation. The sound of horses had stopped now, somewhere near the mouth of their valley. Eleanor could hear men's voices more clearly, though she couldn't make out individual words. There seemed to be 5 or 6 of them, just as the deputy had described. So what do we do? Caleb rewrapped Sarah's letters and the medal, placing them back in the chest with the careful reverence of a man handling sacred relics. We do what we planned. We make them pay such a high price for this valley that they decide revenge isn't worth the cost. He moved to the rifle rack and began checking weapons with the efficient movements of a professional soldier. But Eleanor, you need to understand. If they take me alive, if this goes badly, they won't just kill you quickly. Briggs will want to make you suffer as a way of making me suffer. That's the kind of man he is. Eleanor felt her mouth go dry, but her voice remained steady. Then we make sure it doesn't go badly. There's a possibility we haven't discussed, Caleb said quietly. If you were to leave now, slip out the back and make for the high country, you could probably get away clean. These mountains are full of hiding places, and Briggs doesn't know the terrain the way I do. You could wait up there until the shooting stops, then make your way to town. No, Eleanor, be reasonable. No, she repeated more firmly this time. We've had this conversation. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. The careful protectiveness was still there, but it was joined by something else. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of her strength. All right, he said finally. Then we do this together. But I need you to promise me something. What? If it comes down to a choice between saving yourself and saving me, you choose yourself. I've already lived longer than I probably deserve to, but you have your whole life ahead of you. Eleanor moved to where he stood and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. The only promise I'll make is to fight for both of us. For this place, for what we're building together. For the future we talked about last night. Before he could protest, she rose on her toes and kissed him softly, briefly, but with all the emotion she couldn't put into words. It was their first real kiss, born of desperation and hope in equal measure. When she pulled back, she saw wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Now, she said practically, show me where you want me positioned. And let's make these bastards wish they'd never heard the name Caleb Stone. Outside, a voice began calling across the valley, rough and mocking, with just a hint of accent that might have been southern. Phantom! I know you're in there, you blue-belly son of a bitch. Come out and face me like a man, and maybe I'll make your woman's death quick and clean. Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, saw his hands clench into fists. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and controlled. That's Briggs. And now he's made this personal in a way he probably doesn't understand. Caleb moved to the window and called back, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. Marcus Briggs! Still alive after all these years. I'm disappointed. I thought I'd done a better job of putting you down. Harsh laughter answered him, followed by more crude threats. But Eleanor was no longer listening to the words. She was watching her husband transform from the gentle, reserved man she had come to love into something harder and more dangerous. The legendary soldier who had earned his reputation hunting men through hostile territory. The phantom was waking up, and Marcus Briggs was about to learn that some enemies were better left in the past. The next hour passed intense preparation as Briggs and his men established their positions around the valley mouth. Through careful observation from the cabin windows, Caleb and Eleanor were able to count their enemies and assess their strategy. 6 men, just like the deputy said, Caleb reported, his voice taking on the clipped precision of a military briefing. Briggs is staying back with 2 others, probably to direct the assault and cut off any escape routes. The other 3 are moving to flank positions on either side of the valley. Eleanor checked her rifle for the dozenth time, finding comfort in the familiar routine Caleb had taught her. What's their plan? Classic pincer movement. They'll try to draw my fire from one direction while the others circle around behind us. It's a good strategy if you're dealing with ordinary homesteaders. Caleb's mouth curved in a grim smile. Less effective against someone who's seen it used before. What about the high ground above the valley entrance? You said that was a weak point in our defenses, already taken care of. Caleb nodded toward a pile of rocks near the window. See that cairn? It looks natural, but if you knock the top stone off, it triggers a small avalanche that will clear anyone off those ledges. Sometimes the best defense is making the attacking position untenable. Eleanor stared at him with new respect. How long have you been planning for this kind of attack? Since the day I chose this valley. A man doesn't survive 4 years of war without learning that peace is usually temporary. Caleb moved to another window, studying the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading landscapes for tactical advantages. The question is whether Briggs remembers enough about military tactics to recognize what he's walking into. As if summoned by his name, Briggs's voice echoed across the valley again. Closer this time. You always were too clever for your own good, Phantom. Sitting up there in your little fortress, thinking you're safe. But I learned a few things in the years since Chattanooga, and one of them is patience. He's stalling, Eleanor observed, trying to keep us focused on him while his men get into position. Exactly. Which means we have maybe 10 minutes before they're ready to make their real move. Caleb turned away from the window and faced her directly. Eleanor, I need you to know something before this starts. Whatever happens today, these past few weeks, getting to know you, having you here, it's been the closest thing to happiness I've felt since before the war. She reached out and squeezed his hand, feeling the tremor of emotion beneath his steady exterior. Don't talk like this is goodbye. We're going to survive this, both of us. I hope so. But if we don't, we will. Eleanor's voice was firm with conviction. Because I'm not done fighting for us yet. I haven't come this far and risked this much just to lose you to some ghost from your past. Caleb stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then let's give Mr. Briggs a lesson in why it's dangerous to threaten a phantom's wife. They moved quickly to their predetermined positions, Eleanor at the window facing the barn, where she could cover the most likely approach routes, and Caleb near the fireplace, where he had knocked out thinking between the logs to create firing ports with clear views of the valley mouth. Remember, Caleb said as they settled into position, don't fire until you have a clear target and a sure shot. Ammunition is limited, and every bullet has to count. If they rush the cabin, fall back to the bedroom and barricade the door. There's a loose floorboard near the back wall. Underneath it you'll find a tunnel that leads to the root cellar. From there you can get out and make for the high country. Caleb, just promise me you'll use it if you have to. I can't fight effectively if I'm worried about you being trapped in here with no way out. Eleanor nodded reluctantly. I promise. But only if there's no other choice. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the barn, splintering wood and shattering windows. Eleanor ducked instinctively, then forced herself to peer carefully around the window frame to assess the threat. Muzzle flashes near the tree line, Eleanor called out. her voice surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 2 men, maybe 3, using the big pines for cover. I see them. Caleb's rifle spoke once, a sharp crack that was answered immediately by a cry of pain from the woods. That's 1 down. They're testing our response time and accuracy. More shots rang out, this time from multiple directions. Eleanor could see dirt kicking up in the yard as bullets struck the ground, and she heard the distinctive whine of lead passing close overhead. But none of the shots seemed aimed to kill. They were probing shots, designed to keep the defenders' heads down while the flanking forces moved into position. They're being careful, Eleanor observed. More careful than I expected from a group of bandits. Briggs served in the cavalry. He knows how to conduct a proper assault. Caleb shifted position slightly, his rifle tracking movement in the undergrowth. But he's also impatient. The longer this drags out, the more likely someone will spot the smoke from our chimney and come to investigate. As if he had heard Caleb's analysis, Briggs's voice boomed across the valley once more. Enough of this dancing around! Phantom, you killed my men and cost me my eye. Now I'm going to take everything you care about and make you watch while I do it. Charming fellow, Eleanor muttered, then tensed as she spotted movement near the barn. Caleb, someone's trying to reach the livestock. Let them. The animals are just a distraction. Caleb's voice held grim certainty. Briggs wants me angry and careless. He wants me to rush out there to protect the horses and cattle, where his men can get clear shots at me. Eleanor watched through her rifle sights as 2 figures moved stealthily toward the barn, keeping low and using every available scrap of cover. They were good. Better than she had expected simple bandits to be. But they weren't good enough to escape notice entirely. I have a clear shot at the one on the left, she reported quietly. Take it when you're ready. But remember, once you fire, they'll know exactly where you are. Eleanor steadied her breathing, aligning the rifle sights just as Caleb had taught her. The man was perhaps 70 yards away, moving in a crouch between 2 large rocks. She tracked his movement, leading him slightly, then squeezed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the clearing smoke, she saw her target stumble and fall. He didn't get back up. Good shot, Caleb said with quiet approval. Now move to the other window. They'll be concentrating fire on your position. Eleanor was already moving, staying low, as bullets began chewing up the window frame where she had been positioned moments before. She reached the second window just as Caleb's rifle cracked again, followed by another cry from the woods. That's 3 down, he reported. But they're starting to coordinate better. Get ready for the real push. As if summoned by his words, a volley of gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the valley. This time, the shots were aimed to kill, splintering wood and shattering glass as they sought targets inside the cabin. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, feeling the solid impact of bullets striking the thick log walls. They're moving, Caleb shouted over the noise. 2 men coming straight up the middle using the gunfire to cover their advance. Eleanor risked a quick look and saw them. Dark figures sprinting across the open ground between the woods and the cabin, relying on speed and covering fire to reach their target. They were fast and disciplined, but they were also exposed. Caleb's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, the shots so close together they sounded almost like one continuous crack. Both running figures stumbled and fell, one crying out and crawling toward cover, the other lying motionless in the yard. 5 down, Eleanor breathed, hardly believing their success. Don't celebrate yet, Caleb warned. Briggs is still out there, and he's the most dangerous one. As if to prove his point, a new sound cut through the gunfire, the sharp crack of a rifle firing from an unexpected direction. The bullet passed so close to Caleb's head that Eleanor saw him flinch, and when she looked toward the source of the shot, her blood ran cold. Briggs had somehow circled around to the high ground above the valley. Exactly the position Caleb had said was dangerous. The man was clearly visible against the sky, his distinctive red beard and eye patch making him unmistakable even at a distance. How did he get up there? Eleanor demanded. There's a game trail on the north side that I didn't think anyone else knew about, Caleb replied grimly. Apparently I was wrong. From his elevated position, Briggs commanded a clear view of both their defensive positions. Worse, he was beyond the range of the avalanche trap Caleb had prepared, too high up the mountainside for the falling rocks to reach him. "We have to move," Caleb said decisively. "He can pick us off from up there like fish in a barrel. Where do we go?" "The root cellar. It's the only position that gives us cover from that angle." They began moving toward the back of the cabin. But Briggs's rifle cracked again, and this time Eleanor felt the bullet pass close enough to stir her hair. They were pinned down, caught between their defensive positions and the door to safety. "I can't get a clear shot at him from here," Caleb said, frustration evident in his voice. "The angle's all wrong." Eleanor studied the situation, her mind racing through possibilities. Then suddenly, she remembered something Caleb had mentioned during their preparations. "The cairn," she said urgently. "The one that triggers the avalanche. Where exactly is it?" "About 30 feet from the front door, near the big boulder shaped like—" Caleb stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Eleanor, no. It's too dangerous. You'd be completely exposed. For maybe 10 seconds. And if I can trigger that avalanche, it'll bring down enough rock to either kill Briggs or force him off that ridge. The range is too far. Even if you reach the cairn and trigger it, there's no guarantee the rocks will reach him, but it might. And right now, it's the only chance we have." Another shot from above emphasized their predicament, the bullet striking so close to Eleanor's position that she felt stone chips against her face. "I'm the faster runner," she continued urgently, "and he's focused on you right now. If I move quickly, if you move at all, he'll cut you down before you get halfway there." Eleanor looked at her husband, seeing the fear for her safety warring with his tactical assessment of their situation. She understood his reluctance, but she also understood that staying put meant certain death for both of them. "Caleb," she said softly, "do you trust me?" "With my life." "But this isn't about trust." "Yes, it is." Eleanor moved to the door, her hand on the latch. "You taught me to shoot, to fight, to be your partner in this. Now let me be your partner." For a moment, they stared at each other across the cabin, the sound of Briggs reloading his rifle clear in the sudden quiet. Then Caleb nodded slowly. "When I start shooting, draw his attention and keep him busy. I'll lay down covering fire, but you'll only have seconds. That's all I need." Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her resolve steady. She thought of the pressed wildflower in her Bible, of the broken watch that Caleb had promised to repair, of all the conversations they had yet to have, and the life they were just beginning to build. Then she threw open the door and ran toward their only chance of survival. With her husband's rifle covering her desperate sprint and the sound of Marcus Briggs's triumphant laughter echoing off the mountain walls, Eleanor's feet hit the ground running, her body moving with a grace born of desperation and determination. Behind her, Caleb's rifle began its deadly rhythm, firing as fast as he could work the bolt, each shot designed to keep Briggs's head down and his attention focused away from the woman sprinting across the open yard. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Eleanor was acutely aware of every detail, the way her breath misted in the cool morning air, the sound of her heartbeat thundering in her ears, the feeling of loose gravel shifting under her feet as she dodged between boulders and stumps that offered precious moments of cover. Briggs's rifle cracked overhead, the bullet striking the ground mere inches from her left foot and sending up a spray of dirt and stone chips. She could hear him cursing from his position on the ridge, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Clever little bitch. But you can't run forever." 20 feet to the cairn, 15. Eleanor could see it now, exactly where Caleb had described, a seemingly natural pile of stones near the large boulder that marked the edge of their defensive perimeter. The top stone was slightly different from the others, positioned so that a hard blow would send it tumbling and trigger the carefully balanced avalanche above. 10 feet. Another shot from Briggs, this one so close that Eleanor felt the heat of the bullet's passage against her neck. She stumbled, caught herself, and kept running. 5 feet. Eleanor reached for the family locket her mother had given her years ago, the one piece of jewelry she wore every day. As Briggs fired again, she threw herself forward in a desperate dive, slamming her fist against the top stone of the cairn, just as the bullet meant for her back struck the boulder inches from her head. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Eleanor lay sprawled against the rocks, certain she had failed, certain that Briggs would have time for another shot before she could find cover. Then the mountain moved. It started with a low rumble, like distant thunder or the growl of some massive awakening beast. The top stone of the cairn had triggered exactly what Caleb had intended, a carefully orchestrated avalanche that had been waiting years for the proper catalyst. Hundreds of tons of rock and debris came, cascading down the mountainside with gathering momentum, a grey-brown river of destruction that swept everything in its path. Eleanor pressed herself against the boulder and watched in fascination and terror as the avalanche roared toward Briggs's position with the inevitability of natural disaster. She heard him scream, a sound of pure rage and disbelief that was quickly swallowed by the rumble of falling stone. Then the dust cloud reached her position, and she could see nothing but swirling grit and debris. The rumbling went on for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. When it finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the valley, broken only by the whisper of settling dust and the distant cry of startled birds. Eleanor rose slowly, coughing and wiping dirt from her eyes. Where Briggs had been positioned on the ridge, there was now only a fresh scar of broken rock and a scree slope that extended halfway down the mountain. If the man had survived, he was buried under several tons of granite and sandstone. Eleanor, Caleb's voice cut through the dust, sharp with fear and relief. "Eleanor, where are you?" "Here," she called back, her voice hoarse from inhaling rock dust. "I'm all right." She began making her way back toward the cabin, moving carefully through the settling debris. As the dust cleared, she could see Caleb running toward her, his rifle still in his hands, but his attention focused entirely on her safety. They met halfway across the yard, and Caleb caught her in his arms with enough force to lift her feet off the ground. For a moment they simply held each other, both trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "You magnificent, terrifying woman," Caleb murmured against her hair. "I thought I'd lost you when he fired that last shot, but he didn't hit me," Eleanor interrupted, pulling back to look into his eyes. "We did it, Caleb. We actually did it. You did it. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I've seen men charge enemy artillery positions." Caleb's hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing away the dirt and tears she hadn't realized were there. "Promise me you'll never scare me like that again." "I promise to try not to," Eleanor said with a shaky laugh. "But I can't promise there won't be other situations where—" Her words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed immediately by the whistle of a bullet passing between them. They spun toward the sound and saw a figure emerging from the dust cloud near the avalanche site. Marcus Briggs, bloodied and battered but very much alive, his remaining eye blazing with hatred as he worked the bolt of his rifle for another shot. "Did you think a few rocks would finish me, Phantom?" Briggs shouted, his voice raw from dust and exertion. "I've survived worse than that! And now I'm going to put a bullet in your woman's heart and make you watch her die." Caleb pushed Eleanor behind him and raised his own rifle, but Briggs was already taking aim. At this range, with Eleanor partially exposed, there was no way to guarantee her safety. "Get down," Caleb commanded, but Eleanor was already moving, not away from the danger, but toward her fallen husband's rifle. In their frantic embrace, Caleb had dropped his weapon, and it lay on the ground between them and Briggs. Time slowed to a crawl as Eleanor dove for the rifle. She could see Briggs's finger tightening on his trigger, could see the ugly satisfaction in his remaining eye as he prepared to destroy the woman Caleb loved. She could hear Caleb shouting her name, could feel his hand grasping for her arm as he tried to pull her to safety. Her fingers closed around the rifle stock just as Briggs fired. The bullet meant for her chest struck the weapon instead, the impact spinning the rifle from her grasp and sending her tumbling across the rocky ground. "Eleanor!" Caleb's voice was raw with anguish, but she was already rolling, already reaching for her own rifle, where it had fallen during her desperate run to the cairn. Briggs was working his bolt again, cursing as he tried to clear a jam caused by dust and debris. Eleanor came up on one knee, her rifle rising to her shoulder with smooth precision, her breathing steady despite the chaos around her. "Marcus Briggs," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The one-eyed man looked up from his jammed rifle, his face twisting with surprise and rage at being challenged by the woman he had been trying to kill. Eleanor's rifle cracked once, the shot precise and final. Briggs staggered backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he looked down in surprise at the spreading stain across his chest. "That," Eleanor said quietly, "was for threatening my husband." Briggs toppled backward into the rock and dust, his long pursuit of vengeance ending where it had begun, with a bullet fired by someone defending the people they loved. The silence that followed Eleanor's shot was profound, broken only by the settling dust and the distant sound of a horse whinnying in the barn. Eleanor remained in her shooting position for several heartbeats, her rifle still aimed at Briggs's motionless form, her breathing slow and controlled. Caleb approached her carefully, his own weapon ready, but his attention focused on his wife. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" She lowered the rifle slowly, her hands remarkably steady. "I'm all right. Scraped and bruised, but nothing serious." She looked up at him, her eyes clear despite the magnitude of what she had just done. "Is he—" "He's dead." Caleb's voice carried a note of finality. "It's over." Eleanor nodded, then rose gracefully to her feet, brushing dust from her skirts with movements that seemed almost absurdly normal after the violence of the past hour. "We should check on the animals? Make sure none of them were hurt in the shooting." Caleb stared at her, amazed by her composure. He had seen hardened soldiers break down after their first kill, had watched veteran fighters struggle with the reality of taking a human life. But Eleanor seemed to have accepted the necessity of her action with a clarity that both impressed and concerned him. "Eleanor," he said gently, "what you just did, killing a man, even in self-defense, it changes something inside you. If you need to talk about it, if you need time to process, he was going to kill you," Eleanor interrupted, her voice matter-of-fact. "He was going to kill both of us, probably after making us suffer. I did what needed to be done to protect my family." The simple certainty in her voice, the way she claimed him as family without hesitation or qualification, hit Caleb with unexpected force. He reached for her, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that was part relief, part gratitude, and part something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. "I love you," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "God help me, Eleanor, I love you more than I thought possible." She pulled back to look at him, her face luminous with joy, despite the dirt and exhaustion. "I love you too. I have almost from the beginning, though I wasn't sure you'd ever let yourself feel the same way. I was afraid," Caleb admitted. "Afraid that caring about you would put you in danger. Afraid that I'd lose you the way I lost Sarah. But you just proved that you're strong enough to take care of yourself. Strong enough to be my partner in every sense of the word." Eleanor smiled, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "It took a war to teach us that, didn't it? Sometimes the things that threaten to destroy us end up showing us who we really are." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders coming from the direction of the valley mouth. Caleb tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, but Eleanor laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Listen," she said quietly. The riders were calling out as they approached, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Hello, the cabin! Deputy Marshal Peters with a posse from Silverton. Anyone hurt up there?" Caleb and Eleanor exchanged glances. Then Caleb cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, "All clear, Deputy. The bandits are dead." Within minutes, Peters and 5 other men rode into the yard, their eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. The deputy dismounted and approached Briggs's body, nudging it with his boot to confirm what was already obvious. "Marcus Briggs," he said with satisfaction. "We've been hunting this bastard for 3 years. How many others?" 5 more, Scattered around the valley, Caleb replied. They won't be troubling anyone again. Peters looked from Caleb to Eleanor, noting her disheveled appearance and the rifle still in her hands. Ma'am, were you involved in the fighting? She killed Briggs, Caleb said with unmistakable pride. Saved both our lives with that shot. The deputy's eyebrows rose. Well, I'll be damned. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that's some fine shooting. Briggs was supposed to be fast as lightning with that rifle of his. He was distracted, Eleanor said modestly. And my husband taught me well. As the posse members spread out to collect the bodies and assess the aftermath of the battle, Peters pulled out a worn notebook and began taking statements. The process was routine, names, descriptions of events, confirmation that the shooting had been in self-defense. There'll be a hearing in Silverton next week, Peters explained, but it's just a formality. You folks defended your home against a known criminal gang. There's a bounty on Briggs, too, $500, dead or alive. That'll go to whoever fired the killing shot. Eleanor looked at the money when Peters handed it to her, then wordlessly passed it to Caleb. Use it to repair the barn, she said simply, and maybe to fix your father's watch. Caleb stared at the bills in his hand, then at his wife, understanding that she was offering him more than money. She was offering him the chance to move forward, to invest in their future rather than dwelling on their violent past. Mrs. Stone, Peter said, as the posse prepared to leave. If you don't mind my saying so, you handled yourself like a veteran today. Not many folks could face down men like Briggs and his gang without breaking. Eleanor considered this, then replied thoughtfully, I had something worth fighting for, Deputy. That makes all the difference. After the posse had ridden away with their grim cargo, Caleb and Eleanor stood together in their yard, surveying the damage to their peaceful valley. The barn would need extensive repairs. Several windows were shattered, and the avalanche had permanently altered the landscape above them. But the cabin stood intact. The animals were safe, and they were alive and together. What happens now? Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. Now we rebuild, Caleb said simply. We fix what was broken, we strengthen what survived, and we build something better than what we had before. He paused, then added quietly, and I write those wedding vows I should have written weeks ago. Real ones this time, that reflect what we've become rather than what we started as. Eleanor turned in his arms, her eyes bright with tears of relief and happiness. I'd like that very much. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting their valley in shades of gold and rose, Caleb Stone finally allowed himself to believe that he deserved happiness, that love was worth the risk of loss, and that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not for glory or revenge, but for the simple right to build a life with someone who made that life worth living. 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the same spot where she had first seen their valley, but everything had changed. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger and larger than before. The cabin sported new windows and a fresh coat of chinking between the logs. Most importantly, the careful distance that had once characterized her marriage had been replaced by something warm and real and permanent. Caleb emerged from the workshop he had built near the barn, carrying a small wooden box. His face bore the satisfied expression of a craftsman who had completed a particularly challenging project. Is it finished? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer from his smile. See for yourself. Eleanor opened the box to reveal his father's pocket watch, its silver case polished to a soft gleam, its crystal face replaced and clear. When she held it to her ear, she could hear the steady, reliable tick that marked the passage of time. It's beautiful, she whispered, and it's working perfectly. The watchmaker in Silverton said it was one of the finest mechanisms he'd ever seen. Just needed someone willing to take the time to fix it properly. Caleb took the watch from her hands and wound it carefully. He also said something else interesting. What's that? He said a watch like this was made to last for generations, to be passed down from father to son, father to son. A legacy that keeps time for all the important moments in a family's history. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the implication in his words. Caleb, I want that legacy, Eleanor. I want children who will carry this watch and remember their grandfather they never met. I want to fill this valley with the sounds of family, with laughter and arguments and all the beautiful chaos that comes with building something lasting. Eleanor moved into his arms, her heart so full of happiness that she could barely speak. Are you asking me to help you create that legacy? I'm asking you to marry me, Caleb said solemnly. Really marry me this time. Not because of debts or arrangements or legal necessities, but because we choose each other, because we love each other, because we want to build a life together that's worth all the risks we've taken to get here. From his pocket, he withdrew a ring unlike any Eleanor had ever seen. Instead of gold or silver, it was carved from a piece of deep green stone, polished smooth and set with tiny flecks of what looked like starlight. I made it from serpentine I found in the high country, Caleb explained. It's not traditional, but nothing about us has been traditional. I wanted something that came from this place, something that would remind you every day of where we found each other and what we overcame to be together. Eleanor held out her hand, tears streaming down her face as Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand specifically, which she realized it had been. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. To the marriage, to the children, to the legacy, to whatever comes next. They were married the following Sunday by a circuit preacher who had heard their story and insisted on performing the ceremony for free. The service was simple, just the two of them, the preacher, and a handful of neighbors who had come to witness their union. But the vows they exchanged were anything but simple. They spoke of choosing each other daily, of facing whatever challenges life might bring as partners, of building something beautiful and lasting in their mountain valley. They promised to tend each other's hearts like gardens, to remember that love was both gift and choice, and to never take for granted the miracle of finding someone worth fighting for. When Caleb kissed his bride at the end of the ceremony, Eleanor tasted salt on his lips and realized he was crying too, tears of gratitude and relief and joy that came from a heart finally willing to believe in happiness again. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the western peaks, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. She had come to these mountains as payment for her father's debts, a reluctant bride facing an uncertain future with a stranger. She was leaving that evening as Caleb Stone's chosen wife, a woman who had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and found. Love in the most unlikely of circumstances. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't answered that? Marriage broker's advertisement, she asked, settling more comfortably against her husband's side. Every day, Caleb replied honestly. And every day, I'm grateful that I was desperate enough and lonely enough to take that risk. Even when I was trying to keep you at arm's length, even when I was convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. Part of me knew you were exactly what I needed, even when I was demanding to know why you wouldn't touch me. Caleb laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering dusk. Especially then. You were so fierce, so determined not to accept a half-life. You forced me to see that surviving isn't the same as living, that safety isn't worth much if it means cutting yourself off from everything that makes life meaningful. Eleanor turned to look at him, noting how much younger he appeared when he smiled, how the lines of old pain had softened into something that spoke of contentment rather than endurance. I love you, Caleb Stone, she said simply. Not the man you were before the war, not the legend they called the Phantom, but exactly who you are right now. The man who builds beautiful things, who cares for animals, who reads poetry by firelight and carves wedding rings from mountain stone. And I love you. Eleanor Stone, he replied, using her married name with obvious pleasure. The woman who crossed a continent to marry a stranger, who learned to shoot and fight and defend her home, who refused to accept anything less than a real marriage built on real love. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky, and somewhere in the high country, a wolf sang its ancient song to the moon. But on the porch of their cabin, wrapped in each other's arms and the quiet certainty of their love, Eleanor and Caleb Stone looked toward a future that promised to be as beautiful and challenging and worth fighting for as the mountain valley they now called home. The pocket watch in Caleb's vest ticked steadily, marking the moments of their new beginning with the same reliable rhythm that would measure all the years to come. And pressed between the pages of Eleanor's Bible, a simple wildflower served as a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, love could take root and flourish beyond all expectation. They had found each other through necessity, but they had chosen each other through love. And in the end, Eleanor thought as she watched the stars emerge one by one above their valley, that choice made all the difference in the world.